All right, here's part two. I sure hope you're watching this because we ended part one with some statements that might be not only confusing but maybe even outright offensive to 21st century people who live under the assumptions, of course, that we in fact are empowered with free will, that we make decisions about our lives and that we can have control over the decisions that we make, that we're not robots and puppets. I would say, however, that Luther would agree with that. When I say that Luther rejects the idea of free will, he rejects the idea of human free will in terms of our relationship with God. We have no will that we can draw upon to enter into a relationship with God and thus be reconciled with God. We have no free will that we can act a certain way and then become righteous. Remember, God's will is free. Is free in totality, right? And it's never contingent upon human will. So for Luther, it's important to recognize that humans don't possess the ability to convince God of anything, right? We don't have free will in that regard. Now that does not mean that Luther believes we're robots and puppets and that every move we make, like my move right now to turn my head this way, was preordained by God, and then to turn it back this way, oh, God had decided from eternity that that's what I was going to do with my head at this moment. Of course we choose whether or not we brush our teeth in the morning, or whether or not we're good parents to our children, or whether or not we go to church, or whether or not we feed the hungry and give drink to the thirsty. I mean, we have free will in terms of the ways that we relate to one another and all of that business. But in terms of our relationship with God, we don't. And so in order to fully understand what the Confessions then will say about the nature of humanity, we have to understand kind of this foundation that Luther has built. This pessimistic anthropology that says, and quite frankly, if you think about the doctrine of justification and you allow it to go, and you allow it to go on its full journey, the claim that we are justified, we're made righteous by God because of a thing that God does in Jesus Christ, apart from our works. I mean, it is a natural conclusion then that our works then don't get to kind of determine that relationship. In a sense, the doctrine of justification in and of itself assumes a powerlessness on the part of humanity to reconcile ourselves with God. So I think if you stop to think about it for a little bit, this might make some sense. But the language is so foreign, I think, to 21st century North Americans, that's for sure, that we don't have free will. I mean, whenever I deal with this with my students, typically I spend hours on this, and we've got a 1 credit hour course, and I'm spending moments on it. But it's enough for me that you understand this, that you recognize that for Luther, all the decisions about salvation are made by God. And they're really not contingent upon you and I and our actions and whether or not we say, I believe, right? Again, God is the subject. We are the object. Our saying, I believe in God, is not really all that much of a Lutheran formulation. A Lutheran formulation places God as the subject. God in Jesus Christ has died for me and my sins and reconciled me and saved me. That's the way we kind of about it. That's the trajectory. And so as we get into salvation and justification, hopefully this will help a little bit. It's important for us to know what God thinks about humans and our capacities and our incapacities before we can really, I think, fully understand what it is that Luther says and the Confessions say that God is doing in our lives in Jesus Christ. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now, for those of you who see this as a real problem, I do want to, if I could, read a little bit from Luther's treatise in 1519 on two kinds of righteousness. And this is what he says. He says, the righteousness that we receive in God, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, right? In Christ, right? For this righteousness given in place of the original righteousness lost in Adam, it accomplishes the same as that original righteousness would have accomplished. Rather, it accomplishes more. You know, as Luther speaks then about losing the image of God, or at least having the image of God so obscured that it's unrecognizable, he doesn't leave us there, nor does he believe that God leaves us there. He pushes us further in a trajectory that says what we lose in God, maybe the image of God, we receive tenfold in what I'll call the image of Christ. That what Christ does in reconciling us to God is in fact gives us something that was better. I mean, think about this for a minute. That's better than what was lost by Adam. in the fall. And for those who wish to psychologize Luther and talk about him as this crazy person who could do nothing but speak about the worthlessness of humanity, keep in mind that as he develops his ideas, what he's saying is that we are actually in a better place now because of what God has done through us in Christ, fully reconciling ourselves, right, or reconciling us to God. We're in a better place than we would have been had the original sin never happened. And there's our hope. Now, why does Luther do this? I want you to consider that Luther is doing this with a pastor's heart. I mean, Luther is engaging what he believes, whether or not it's true or not, arguable, but what he believes is a religious system in which your salvation is always in doubt, in which you're always having to try and make sure that you are reconciled to God through the church, right, through your priest. And let's say your local priest takes a disliking to you and excommunicates you, and now your salvation is in doubt and all these other sorts of things. What Luther is trying to do is say, don't worry about all that stuff. Don't spend your time fearing whether or not God is going to save you and all this business, because God's either going to do it or not. God's decision has already been made. It has nothing to do with your actions or with the determinations of the church or your local priest. He's actually trying to take away from people this sense of uncertainty about their salvation. I think as a pastor, what Luther is trying to do is say this: listen, you don't have any free will. God makes these decisions. You can brush your teeth. You have free will on terms of those things. You can cheat your neighbor. You have free will when it comes to that. But when it comes to God's loving you, you have no free will. In the same way that my children don't have any free will when it comes to my love for them. They can say whatever they want to me. They can say, you're not my daddy anymore. They get mad at me because I take away a toy, and they say, I don't love you, and all of those other sorts of things. They can say that all they want. But they have no power to change what my love is towards them, right? That's mine. Yeah? I love them regardless of what they think about me and whether they're accepting that love at certain times in their lives or rejecting it, right? In the same way, I think Luther's trying to set people free by letting them know that these are the issues that you don't have to worry about. God has made these decisions. It's not contingent upon you or your will. So now live as though you believe the promise that God has made to you, that you are reconciled in Christ, and go love your neighbor. Not because you're going to impress God with that love, but because that's what redeemed people who no longer fear death do. Let me say one other thing, though. There's one other issue, and that has to do, especially if you read Bondage to the Will for Luther, he takes this one step further. Not only does Luther believe that God alone chooses who's saved, and that this is a decision God makes regardless of what you and I think about whether or not it's just or right or anything like that, he also will go so far as to say that God will choose who is damned. Right? This is this double predestination that we oftentimes attach to Calvin, that God chooses the saved and God chooses the damned, and that we really have no ability to change that. And so we live our lives understanding that these things are finally God's decision. Now, I'm oversimplifying this because I have like a minute left here. It's important for us to understand that the confessions essentially reject this, and that's important for us to know. That there are times where the confessions themselves say, okay, maybe what Luther said on this topic isn't what we're going to confess as a church. When we read, for instance, in the Formula of Concord, the final decisions about predestination and election, what the reformers will finally say, and what the confessions of our church are, what the doctrine of our church is that certainly God chooses who is saved. But then they leave the question of damnation open, right? As something that human beings probably ought not be spending a whole lot of time trying to consider, because it really isn't our place to determine whether or not we understand the full reality of how God chooses not only who is saved, but who is damned. So in that place, this is one of those little areas in which the confessions actually provide perhaps a correction to Luther and Luther's own thinking, which reminds us again that Luther's thought itself is Luther's thought, but not necessarily always the doctrine of our church. Let that be enough for now. If you have questions about this, let's talk about them in the forums. You're also welcome to call me. My cell phone number is 563. Well, I'm not going to give it. I'm not going to give this out on YouTube, but you can get a hold of me, and we can discuss this more. So now go into this assignment and suss it out, and look forward to hearing your comments in the forums. Thanks for your time.